We are into our third week in SPS102A, into our second week on the Renaissance. The first week was very general about early modernity and modernity, and then I said that I would be spending 2 weeks about the Renaissance as a major component of this early modernity period, one of the 7 or 8 or 9 major processes in it. Here in SPS 102A, as I have said repeatedly, I'm dealing with the Renaissance in a more general kind of way, and of course in Hume 102A, I'm really trying to go in depth into Renaissance art. So, I have in my title 3 key words: patronage, production, and demand. Demand is perhaps easier explained. It is very basic economics. In a market economy, we are constantly dealing with the demand side and the supply side. Talep ve arz. All kinds of producers produce for the market economy under various conditions of production, including cost, materials, small scale, large scale, whatever. So that becomes the supply side. And on the other hand, there has to be a certain demand for it if such production is going to be profitable. That is to say, if it is going to be able to be sold on the market so that the producers can earn money. I am suggesting here very simply that there is also a demand side and a supply side to art in general, as with all kinds of human activity, and that in this lecture I will be dealing with the demand side of Renaissance art. The other 2 keywords are patronage and production. Production, art and production, sanat ve üretim. At first sight, it might be difficult to put the 2 together. When we speak of art, artists, especially great artists, especially the greatest artists like Leonardo or Michelangelo or Raphael, or in literature, when we are talking about maybe Shakespeare or Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, it might be difficult to conceive of what they are doing as production in the economic sense, as a kind of production. We tend to think of art, perhaps because of 18th and 19th century Romanticism. We have this maybe romantic view of great art, that is to say, it looks like a solitary and unparalleled kind of act of creation. A person of incredible talent sits down and writes some poetry or carves marble to produce a statue or paints to produce an incredibly beautiful painting, or sits down like Beethoven and composes a great piece of music. And it seems like something inimitable, unparalleled, completely unique, an act of, well, I hesitate to pronounce it, but almost divine creation. Incredible powers resting in that individual human being. But against, so we tend to think of art as just solitary creation by geniuses. When we speak of production, we tend to think of peasants in their fields or industrial workers in their factories. And as I've said, it seems difficult to put together, for example, industrialized mass production with these acts of individual creativity. And of course, this is further enhanced by something that I have mentioned again and again. Art history tends to focus only on masterpieces, only on, well, consider your textbooks. Consider your readings from Helen Gardner or Jansen and Jansen or Anner and Fleming, etc. When you are reading these pages, as I hope you are doing, as I hope you have started doing, what you come up against is works by the very, very talented, the good or the greatest works of art, whether in painting or sculpture or architecture. But remember this, that I've been stressing again and again. Behind every such masterpiece by Andrea Castagno or Veneziano or Filippo Lippi or Brunelleschi or Botticelli or Leonardo or Michelangelo, whatever, behind every such masterpiece there are hundreds and thousands of bad or just average, just mediocre workers. Because there is some kind of art market involved, and there is a demand side, and on the supply side, not only extremely talented people, but also people of just average capabilities are trying to produce in order to sell and in order to be able to make some money for themselves. So it is important, and mind you, this is a contribution of the last 50 years or so to history and art history. It is important to be able to consider art also as some kind of production process. In fact, this is implicit in the beginnings. The Greek word, the ancient Greek word for art is techne, which means technique, which is the root of all our words about technique and technology. So it means basically crafts. And look at also our own Turkish terminology of Middle Eastern origin, the relationship between sanat and zanaat, arts and crafts. Where does zanaat come to an end? When does the zanaatkar begin to become a sanatkar? And what is the very thin line dividing them? All these great Renaissance artists, I mean, in Florence and all over Italy, I will be speaking of craft guilds, lonjalar. All these masters, journeymen, apprentices belong to a profession and therefore also to a guild, bir lonca. And that guild was not defined as an arts guild, it was defined as a crafts guild, bir zanaatkar loncası. They all started out as zanaatkar, as craftsmen, and I mean, consider Ghiberti, for example, whom I shall be coming to, if not today, on Wednesday. Ghiberti was trained as a goldsmith, bir mücevherci. And from this crafts training as a goldsmith, he went on to become an incredible sculptor operating in relief sculpture. So if we taking you back to the first semester, to the beginnings of art. Consider, for example, pottery. Making pots from clay and firing them at very high temperatures so that they achieve solidity and durability. At first, it is purely functional up to a point. That is to say, the people who make pots are just thinking of storing and being able to carry food and water or solids and liquids and maybe cooking in them and maybe being able to keep them, preventing them from rotting, protecting them from the elements, etc. But I think we have seen this in SPS101 and HUME 101. Up to a point, they operate in purely functional design, but after a point, they just begin to experiment. They start creating pottery shapes that do not necessarily have any specific function. The idea of the autonomy of form, biçimin özerkliği, they catch on to that idea and they start experimenting with creating elongated spouts or 2 handles or 5 handles or rims and spouts in animal shapes, etc., which are a considerable step beyond function. Salt işlevselliğin ötesine bir adım, and it is the human imagination being to experiment in search of aesthetics, in search of beauty. So this about both production and the complex and difficult to define relationship between zanaat and sanat, between crafts and art. The question of patronage. Himaye, protection, sponsoring. I mean, in modern terminology, we would probably speak of sponsoring and sponsors. People who pay money for various enterprises, various kinds of human activities that are not really their own profession, but which they want to be subsidizing, protecting, fostering the development of. Modern Turkey, present-day Turkey. Consider the Koç family and the Sabancı family, for example. They invest some amount of money in constructing schools. The Koç family have a high school to their name, but they also keep paying for many, many primary school buildings and middle school buildings, etc., all over Turkey. The Sabancı family do not have a high school to their name, but they also keep funding all kinds of school construction projects. Both great families and great holdings have set up universities. There is Koç University and there is Sabancı University. And they have also set up museums or art galleries. There is the Sadberkanım Museum out on the Bosphorus, named after the late wife of the late Vehbi Koç. And there is the Sakıp Sabancı Museum, which is the University Museum of Sabancı University. What is all this example of? Patronage. If you look at second half of the 19th century American society, it is full of examples of patronage. Outside direct economic activity, actually it starts in the 17th century. Why is Harvard University Harvard University? Because somebody by the name of John Harvard donated his 600, 700 book library, which was a very sizable library at that time, to start a seminary, and from that it eventually took the name of Harvard University. So with Yale, a few decades later, some merchant by the name of Elihu Yale donated a significant amount of money to set up an educational institution in New Haven that would be the rival of Harvard in Boston. So many American universities bear the name of their initial founders, patrons, sponsors, who invested this or that amount of money in order to create them. Consider Stanford, consider Brown. You can go down the list. There are dozens and dozens of such universities, including museums, including libraries, etc., who bear the name of their initial founder or donor. So, this business of rich people, people with money, power, and influence, somehow stepping into the field of art and literature and finding ways to protect and sponsor artists, placing orders or commissions with them, requesting suitable art, and therefore, I mean, when we say suitable, suitable for their own purposes and tastes, this becomes a crucial factor in trying to understand art history. We simply cannot speak of the history of art as isolated from the question of patronage. Whether East or West, whether in medieval Europe or Renaissance Europe, or in the lands of Islam from the birth and spread of Islam onward, whether we are talking about the Mamluk Sultanate or the Seljuks or the Ottomans, there is always this question of patronage in the background, actually enormously dominating and influencing artistic production. So, just some general reminders. All this is, as I've said, over the last 50 years, there has been increasingly a movement away in art history from understanding art purely as solitary acts of creation to conceiving of it as part of society surrounded by economic and social networks of all kinds, and the enormous question of patronage and production in this regard. After all this, back to the Renaissance. The demand side and the supply side of art production in the Renaissance. Today, I'm going to be basically dealing with the demand side, and on Wednesday, I'll basically be dealing with the supply side. The demand side, who is willing to order? Who is willing to commission? Who is willing to pay? Are they competing with each other, these people who pay? Is there any degree of rivalry or competition between them? And why are they doing this? Why are they so willing to commission and to pay? Neden birdenbire bu kadar çok sipariş vermek ve bu kadar çok para ödemek istiyorlar? Hayrola ne oluyor? And for what sort of art? This is the demand question. The supply side, who is producing on the supply side to meet this demand? How are the producers or suppliers organized? What sorts of people are willing to compete to get those orders or commissions and to produce to meet that demand, and how? So this is the fundamental, basic, maybe simple perspective that I'm putting before you in order to understand Renaissance art, the Italian Renaissance, not as some kind of mystical, inexplicable kind of miracle, but as something solidly grounded in the development of society. Under the heading of demand for art in the Italian Renaissance, I'm going to address questions of Italy's political structure, Italy's new economy and wealth, and the composition of Italian society. What time frame are we talking about? Let me repeat. Maybe from the first half of the 14th century. Remember, in the early 14th century, we have an overlap between late medieval art and early Renaissance art. Just to remind you of some names, Duccio and Cimabue and Giotto. We have Duccio and Cimabue as characteristically late medieval painters, and we have Giotto as noticeably different after a certain point, representing the birth of the early Renaissance. So Giotto dies. Giotto is supposed to have been born in 1267 and dies in 1337, almost 70 years old. So starting from that to the early 16th century, maybe with the death of Leonardo, so we are speaking of Italy's political structure and new economy and wealth and social composition over those 200 years. Italy in the late Middle Ages. What do we immediately notice? There is no political unity. There is no such thing as a unified Italy. It will only happen in the late 19th century, 1870. Instead, what we have is, we have a situation that can be described as small and many. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 8 or 9 different political units. Some of them relatively larger, but remember, even what is called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies is less than half of Italy. And then you have 8 smaller units, all cramped into central and northern Italy. What this means is, in political terms, there is stiff competition between these units. Competition, political and military competition, but competition becomes the key word here. It is a bit like ancient Greece. If I might take you back again to the first semester, think of the ancient Greek city-states. Think of Athens, Sparta, Thebai, Corinthos, Megara, etc. Lots and lots of small city-states, none of whom, not a single one of which, is able to capture, conquer, and dominate and unify all the others. They are, to some extent, more or less of equal strength, equal power, so they keep neutralizing each other, and they keep coexisting over a long time, as a result of which there is this continuous competition between them. And there is a similar situation here. Until the 19th century, none of these units will grow to become much more powerful than the rest and capable of swallowing the rest, and therefore they will be constantly vying with each other for power and influence. So this situation of small and many is perpetuated over many centuries. Here you have the map, the visuality, and here you have a list of these various units. Please note, up north is the Holy Roman Empire, is Germany, and its influence extends into North Italy, so you have imperial territories in northern Italy. Crucially, you have the papal court in Rome. I will come back to this problem. The papacy is fundamentally religious. That is to say, it claims religious, spiritual supremacy and jurisdiction over all of Christendom. But at the same time, the anomaly is it is also a state. And it is not a very big state, but a relatively small state in Italy. And therefore, it is involved in Italian politics. You might think that some kind of authority which claims religious and spiritual superiority over everybody else, you might think that it might remain aloof of politics and at least seem to be pure and uncorrupted by political competition. But it is not like that. The papacy is intensely involved in the internal politics of Italy, competing with all these other states, making war against them, trying to expand against them, against some of them, and also trying to protect itself against expansion by these others. This will have a profoundly eroding kind of influence on the prestige and authority of the papacy, and it will have a crucial impact eventually on the outburst of the Protestant Reformation. I will be coming to that, but note the papacy for the time being. And then also a third category and a fourth category. You have a number of political units that are republics. But we shouldn't understand democratic republics as at present. They are what we call republican oligarchies: Florence, Siena, Lucca, Venice, Genoa. That is to say, there is no such thing as general elections. There is no such thing as everybody voting. They are not monarchies. They are not dynastic. You have what you might call a process of election or selection within a very rich and powerful oligarchical elite. But crucially, you don't have a royal dynasty of some kind. And then you also have numerous princely courts, they are dominated by ruling families, the ruling families of Aragon or the Sforza, d'Este, Montefeltro, Gonzaga, Malatesta, etc. That's to say, Milan, Ferrara, Modena and Urbino, Mantua, Rimini, Bologna, etc., etc. So this is the political stage, fragmentation, and therefore competition. This goes hand in hand with, in the 14th, 15th, and early 16th centuries, compared with the rest of Europe, and also in an absolute sense, the concentration of immense wealth in Italy, especially northern Italy. In 1346, a map of cities and trade routes in Europe. So you have to allow for the projection. Out it is curved like this. Out here is, well, this is already Central Asia, and over here is China, and somewhere down here is the Indian subcontinent. So you have, what do you see immediately at first sight? Look here in northern Italy, and look here in what is today Holland and Belgium. In general, in Europe at this time, in the middle of the 14th century, cities are relatively few and far between, but you have an immense concentration of towns and cities in northern Italy, and a second concentration, though not as dense, in the lowlands, in Felemenk, over here. In fact, urbanization in northern Italy is so dense, the map makers of this historical atlas have not been able to put everything in there, and here is an extra expanded legend where you can trace other towns that could not be named here. So notice also the trade routes. The trade routes of the ancient and medieval world, the so-called Silk Route, İpek Yolu, coming all the way from China across Central Asia and converging on Byzantine Constantinople, later Ottoman Istanbul, and the spice route, the so-called Baharat Yolu, originating in Southeast Asia somewhere here, coming across the Indian Ocean into the Indian subcontinent, and then either entering the Gulf or entering the Red Sea, converging on Cairo, Alexandria, Damascus, and Aleppo, Sham, Halep, Kahire, Iskenderiye. And then notice what happens. Once these two trade routes arrive at these terminals in the Eastern Mediterranean, and then you see some very thick black lines leading from these terminals up here and up here. Where do they go? Two big Italian maritime cities, Venice and Genoa. So what happens is, from Constantinople, Istanbul, and eventually Bursa, and Aleppo and Damascus and Cairo, it is Italian merchants who pick up these goods in their ships, in their convoys, and take them to Venice and Genoa, and from there they are distributed, disseminated all over the rest of Europe. This international trade leads to an enormous concentration of commercial profits in northern Italy, but it is not just trade and commerce, it is also production, especially textile production. Textiles are, of course, crucial. They are a mass consumer good, and how and where, in what sectors do these Italian cities obtain their enormous profits and early capital accumulation? From trade and commerce and banking, and also textile production. These trade networks also bring death with them. Think of epidemics, think of illnesses, contagious diseases in world history. If human settlements, societies, cities are not connected with each other, you don't really get epidemics or pandemics. But as trade and commerce lead to greater and greater contact between different geographies. All right, this has its profit side, but it also has its dark side, the spread of microorganisms, the spread of contagious diseases. More or less at the same time with the previous map, from 1346 to 53, Europe is hit by an incredible wave of the bubonic plague, hıyarcıklı veba, which is carried by rats and parasites on rats, and it comes into Europe, well, the Mongol Khanate unifying Central Asia, and therefore leading to transmission of parasites and host animals, together with goods, together with commercial commodities, and the Mongol army lays siege to a fortress, a city in Crimea, and of course Italian merchants are dealing very heavily with the Black Sea and with Crimea as part of their commercial networks, and they pick up the rats, they pick up the mice, they pick up the parasites, and bring them into Italy, from which they spread all over Europe, and it is estimated that in these 7 years or so, 50% of Europe's population dies from the bubonic plague. 50%. It is called the Black Death because as the illness develops over 2 or 3 days, people suffering and dying from it tend to acquire a blackish hue. But Europe recovers. The Black Death is over. It will keep, epidemics like this will keep recurring, but not ever again at this level. And 1483, this is like 2 years after the death of Mehmed II in the Ottoman Empire. It is also the year when the Portuguese explorer Captain Bartolomeu Diaz for the first time reaches the southernmost tip of Africa, looking as he is for a sea route to India, around Africa. But the concentration of urbanization in Italy has become even more intensive, if anything. Cities are increasing elsewhere, but again, Italy leads the way in urbanization and capital accumulation in Europe at this time. And this will be this new wealth. This is what we mean by the new wealth of Italy. It will be this new wealth that constitutes the demand side of Renaissance art. What happens is, in all these Italian cities, large or medium-sized or smaller, that you see in especially northern Italy, there arise great merchant and banking families living in urban space. They don't live in the countryside anymore. They live in urban space. And they build their townhouses or palaces, which I shall come to, and they frequent their distinct churches in the surrounding neighborhoods, and they compete for power in the city. Whether the city is Florence, or Milan, or Bologna, or Verona, whatever. This is a plan of Florence. You have already seen some elements of it in terms of buildings. Here is typically Italian cities have two centers, the political center and the religious center. Consider Ottoman Istanbul. There is the Topkapı Palace and there is the Süleymaniye. Okay? There is the Süleymaniye or the Ayasofya or the Blue Mosque, Sultan Ahmed's Mosque. That is to say, there are great mosques and there is also the political center of power, the Topkapı Palace itself, and the Baba Ali, the Grand Vizier's palace, in close proximity to it. Similarly, here you have the religious center, the cathedral, the Duomo, the baptistery, and the bell tower. This is the religious center. And here you have the political center, the Palazzo dei Priori, or the Palazzo Vecchio, the old palace or the municipal palace, the palace of city government. Around, you have various districts or neighborhoods. Look, these are all churches, major churches, of course not the cathedral, but these are other major churches in the outlying neighborhoods. Santa Maria Novella, Santa Annunziata, Santa Croce, Santo Spirito, Santa Maria del Carmine, etc. What this map doesn't show is the nearby palaces of the new merchant class. But here in all these districts, you have the nearby palaces of the new merchant and banking elite residing in the neighborhoods, and they are the patrons of these churches, actually. Think of, again, Ottoman Istanbul. You have the very central Selatin camileri, that is to say the imperial mosques, on the skyline of the historical peninsula. And then you also have all kinds of secondary mosques in the outlying neighborhoods, probably commissioned by grand viziers or other leading dignitaries. Think of, for example, Sokollu Mehmet Pasha's mosque, or think of the Rüstem Pasha Camii, etc., and many like that. This is a rough and approximate kind of parallel. My point is this: these leading merchant and banking families reside in these neighborhoods and compete for gaining power here in the political center of the city. Florence is a typical Republican oligarchy. For a long time, until the Medici seized power, it does not have a dynasty. Instead, it has many such influential families competing for power, competing to be elected to the city council, the city government, etc. Families like this, you have seen this before. This is, when I was dealing with portraits, it was in Hume 102A, but this is a posthumous, 50 years after his death, kind of painting by Pontormo of the famous founder of the most famous of these families, the Medici family. So this is a personal image, and we also have their architectural embodiments. Where did they live? What was their architectural embodiment? There were so-called palaces, Italian singular palazzo, plural palazzi. It is, don't think of an imperial royal kind of palace. It is better translated as konak instead of saray. These are townhouses, magnificent townhouses. Think like this. Previously in the Middle Ages, the ruling elite would be living in the countryside, in the rural areas, in what? In castles, chateaular. Now, because of the development of trade and commerce and urbanization, at least in Italy, what has happened is they have abandoned their countryside castles and they have moved to the city, to cities like Florence, Rome, Venice, Verona, Bologna, Milan, etc., etc. And they are no longer living in rural castles, but urban palazzi, urban townhouses. So an Italian Renaissance townhouse, a palazzo, is like the urban remanifestation of what was a castle in the countryside in the Middle Ages. Orta Çağ şatoları ticaret ve kentleşme temelinde şehre taşınınca palazzo oluyorlar. What did they look like? Now for visuals. This is one of the oldest. In the political center, I mean this is the municipal palace. Bu belediye sarayı, şehir yönetimi sarayı, öyle düşünebilirsiniz. You can think of it like that. It is called the Palazzo Signoria, or the Palazzo dei Priori, or the Palazzo Vecchio in very central Florence. Notice, it still looks something like a castle, reminiscent of its medieval, rural, provincial origins. But quickly, they change. This is the Palazzo Davanzati in Florence. 5 floors. It's an exception. What will happen is, as I shall be showing you, it will be consolidated into 3 floors. Why 3 floors? I will explain. But here it is 5 floors because the building lot, arsa, is very narrow in front. So they don't have much space, so they go up. There is a characteristic scheme. Look and try to see, try to observe. There is the ground floor. And then there are floors 2, 3, 4. What is the difference between the ground floor and these upper floors? There is an obvious and striking kind of difference. The ground floor has big, very strong doors or gates, fortified gates, as if they were, preparing to defend against an attack of some sort. It has very tiny windows high up, and the 2nd, 3rd, 4th floors are different. They have much bigger windows, and they look less like a fortress. The ground floor is the family business. It is the merchant company, the bank, the warehouse, the storehouse, şirket, banka, depot, entrepot. It is where all the goods are stored, all the money is kept, probably, and against the possibility of urban unrest or revolt or violence, chaos, etc., it is very strongly fortified. The 2nd and 3rd floors are where the wealthy family live. The 4th floor is for male and female servants and maids. And the 5th floor is an open loggia or terrace for relief from the heat in the summer. For the family, to rest maybe in the afternoons. Eventually what happens is this 5-floor scheme comes to be consolidated into a 3-floor scheme. This is the Medici Riccardi Palace, so-called because it was initially built for the Medici, but eventually sold to the Riccardi family. So you have 1, 2, 3 floors. The family business, the merchant company and bank, the ground floor, and the 2nd floor for the family, and the 3rd floor for the servants and maids. And you get the same pattern again and again. The Rucellai Palace, the ground floor, again, more elegant than the previous examples, but still different from the 2nd and 3rd floors. The family's own residence, and for the servants and maids. And the Gondi Palace, again the same thing, the very heavily rusticated ground floor, and the family residence and the servants and maids' quarters up top. A most typical, a very iconic kind of Renaissance palace, the Palazzo Strozzi. It is very big, very boxy, and very strongly fortified. Again, the typical business and bank floor, the family residence, and the servants and maids' quarters up top. But so, this question, judging from these appearances, are these buildings absolutely solid? No. There is a thin shell outside, and inside there are courtyards. When you go through this door, or when you go through these gates, most typically in the Medici Riccardi Palace, when you go through these 2 massive gates, suddenly inside, this is where you arrive. Think of it like this. You have to understand the architectural logic. The Strozzi Palace, if it were absolutely solid, consider rooms in the middle of the building. How would they get light? How would they get heat? They would be absolutely unable to have windows to benefit from natural sunlight, to benefit from the natural heat, the warming effect of the sun. So what they are like is, there is an outer shell, and in the middle the courtyard, avlu. So the outer shell is like a corridor, and there are rooms on both sides. There are rooms with their windows opening to the outside of the building, and there are rooms with their windows opening onto the courtyard. So either directly from the outside or through the courtyard, all rooms on all floors are able to benefit from sunlight and the warmth of the sun to some extent, of course, depending on the seasons. And as you can see, these courtyards, they are, when you go into the interior, it is all so much more elegant and ornamented compared with the outside of the building. Look at these thin and beautiful, elegant columns, these elegant arches, and these decorations, and all the statues in the courtyard. I have dwelt at some length on these palaces in Florence as an example, because, as I've said, they are the architectural embodiment of this new ruling class, a merchant banker kind of aristocracy, wielding wealth, wielding power. So it is this class that dominates these Italian city-states, and all such cities, principalities, duchies, republics, they are all engaged in intense rivalry, intense competition with each other. This is political and military, but it is also symbolic and artistic. Which city will be the most beautiful? Which city will have the most magnificent palaces and churches, cathedrals, and public squares? Within each city, the Koch and Sabancı syndrome, that is to say, which of these families will have the most beautiful palace, the most splendid district church? Which palace will have been built by who, which most famous architect? Inside the palace or the neighborhood church? Who will have made what famous painter of the epoch will have painted the most beautiful frescoes? My palace is more beautiful than yours. You know who built my palace? Michelangelo. You know who built my palace? Michelangelo. Kind of. This is what I call the Koch and Sabancı, or the Harvard and Yale, or the Stanford and Rutgers, whatever, competition syndrome. Consider Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the famous play. It takes place in the city of Verona. And why does it turn out to be a tragedy? Because there are two great and powerful families, the Montagues and the Capulets, who are rivals to each other and absolutely hate each other's guts. And it is this that leads to the tragedy between the two young lovers. So we have political competition and competition through art, and this is the demand side. And on Wednesday, I'll be dealing with the supply side, complementing this. Thank you.